Today, nearly 48 hours after the first polls closed on election night, and the presidential race is still too close to call. Plus, while America was waiting for a decision on its next president, the country passed a grim milestone in its battle against COVID-19. And finally, Amazon boss Jeff Bezos cashes out billions of dollars worth of stock. I'm Mackenzie Sagalos, and this is CNBC After Hours. For the fourth day in a row, we're seeing impressive gains on Wall Street. Stocks are on track to post their best week since all the way back in April. The win comes after Jay Powell, the chair of the Federal Reserve, said that the central bank has more tools in its toolkit to help stimulate the economy if needed. And today's market rally continues this week's strong performance amid the ongoing presidential election. That's right, it's Thursday, and we're still waiting on a couple of key states to finish counting ballots as the race for the White House is on a razor's edge. Those states: Arizona, Nevada, North Carolina, Georgia, and Pennsylvania. Now, Vice President Biden is currently leading in NBC News' electoral count, but it's not over yet. And President Trump's campaign has filed legal challenges in some of these swing states. Two have already been dismissed. A judge in Michigan rejected Trump's effort to stop counting ballots there. And another judge in Georgia tossed a suit in which the campaign alleged that a Republican poll observer witnessed ballots placed in the wrong piles. NBC News has already called Michigan for Biden, although Georgia is still too close to call. And over in Pennsylvania, election officials say they could have a winner later today. That state has 20 electoral votes, which, if NBC News calls for Biden, would put him over the 270 threshold that he needs to become the next president of the United States. Okay, let's get to our sound check. Here's a roundup of the day's biggest action and what the top newsmakers and business leaders had to say on CNBC's airwaves.
Joe Biden and Mitch McConnell, who know each other for a long time and have worked pretty well together, it will create balance and will really help President Biden unite the country.
If we run the process, and at the end of that process, if the president is reelected, will we have a peaceful retention of power? I certainly hope that we will, and I hope Joe Biden, and I expect him to, would step up to help do everything he can to make sure that happens.
I think markets are operating the way that they're expected to. So coming into this period of time, we didn't take any steps above and beyond what we do all the time because we never know when market volatility might hit. So we need to be ready for it at any point in time, just like we were in the spring when the pandemic really triggered major market volatility. What we've seen is that, the election has been a bit of uncertainty that was, out there as investors were looking towards what steps to might take in the market. The markets are reacting pretty well right now.
We think that there's about $10 billion in upside just from states moving the needle. And the good news is, as you get incremental states like Montana was a surprise to us for adult use on the election night. South Dakota for adult use was a surprise to us. Now you have 4 Republican senators that are representing adult use states. So it helps.
As the country parses through mail-in ballots in anticipation of a final result in the presidential election, we've quietly crossed a new milestone in the coronavirus pandemic. Yesterday, the United States reported more than 100,000 new cases of COVID-19 for the first time. The country crossed this threshold just as the UK enters its second mandatory lockdown. Prime Minister Boris Johnson put in place more restrictive measures in response to a severe resurgence of the virus. Those restrictions went into effect today. Just last week, former FDA Commissioner Scott Gottlieb told CNBC that as far as infection trends go, we're only about 3 weeks behind Europe here in the U.S. We asked CNBC healthcare reporter Meg Terrell to walk us through the numbers and how much worse experts project the pandemic will get.
The day after the U.S. presidential election, we topped the 100,000 new daily cases milestone in the U.S. And it's a milestone that public health experts have been worried about us hitting and warning us that we might hit for some time. Dr. Fauci during the summer said that if cases kept going the way they were going then, we could hit it back then. Now that peak in cases didn't get this high. We, however, have reached this milestone now. And while we are doing more testing, that doesn't explain the rise in the number of cases. And of course, the more concerning measure is hospitalizations, and then the one that follows on from that is the number of deaths. And we are starting to see those rise as well. Hospitalizations are now at 53,000 total in the United States. That's the number of Americans in the hospital with COVID-19 right now. The number of deaths recorded each day is also rising. Yesterday it was more than 1,000, and on the 7-day average it's now more than 850. And so what you typically tend to see is that cases start to rise first. A few weeks later, hospitalizations begin to rise. A few weeks after that, deaths begin to rise. And the main concern is that hospitals will become overwhelmed as cases continue to surge throughout the cold months. And we are already seeing in 4 states, ICU capacity is considered constrained. They've essentially filled more than 80% of their ICU beds. And in 26 states, you are seeing a high number of patients in the ICU, more than 70% of ICU beds filled. And it's not just beds that are the real concern. You can sort of create more beds. You can't create more doctors and nurses to take care of all these critical patients. And that's why people worry when we overwhelm the system, you start to see the deaths numbers rising. One thing seems really certain from everybody that I talk to in the public health world, it's that the federal government is not going to implement any kind of national orders. They won't even implement a national mask mandate. So thinking about the White House telling the country to stay at home if you can, the way they did back in the spring, is not something that people expect to happen. The Trump administration, regardless of who wins this election, is going to be in charge of the coronavirus response from the national level, of course, until January 20th. Public health experts are warning that on the trajectory we're on, we just hit 100,000 new cases a day. Carlos Del Rio at Emory warned today, we could see 200,000 new cases per day by Thanksgiving if the trends keep going the way they're going.
Okay, time for today's numbers round. First up is 300. ESPN will cut 300 jobs, roughly 6% of its workforce, and let its current 200 open positions go unfilled. That's according to a company memo sent today by the network's chairman. The layoffs will be company-wide, but are mostly concentrated in broadcast television production. These cuts are the latest in a series of reductions the sports network, which is owned by Disney, has made in recent years. In 2015, ESPN laid off 300 people, and then another 250 in 2017. Next is 100. On Election Day, San Francisco voters overwhelmingly approved a new overpaid executive tax on companies with CEOs who make more than 100 times more than the average employee's salary. Affected firms will pay an extra 0.1% on top of its annual business tax. And finally, $3 billion. Jeff Bezos has sold more than $3 billion worth of Amazon shares this week, according to SEC filings. That brings his 2020 cash-out total to more than $10 billion. But don't worry about Bezos. He still owns more than 53 million shares in the e-commerce giant that he founded, currently worth nearly $170 billion. That's it for After Hours, but here's one more thing to keep an eye on. Tomorrow is Jobs Day, meaning that we'll learn how many people went back to work in October and get a better idea of how well the economy is recovering as COVID-19 cases in the U.S. rise higher and higher. Check out CNBC.com and download the CNBC app to see those numbers as soon as we have them at 8:30 Eastern in the morning. And we'll be back here in our home office tomorrow with a new edition of After Hours, so be sure to catch us then.